Hi, welcome back to the Facebook Bible study through the story by Max Lucado and Randy Frazzi. Um I want to open this second session through the story with this quote from Henry Van Dyke about how he saw the Bible. He says it this way: born in the East and clothed in Oriental form and imagery, the Bible walks the ways of all the world with familiar feet and enters land after land to find its own everywhere. It has learned to speak in hundreds of languages to the heart of man. Children listen to its stories with wonder and delight, and wise men ponder them as parables of life. The wicked and the proud tremble at its warnings, but to the wounded and penitent it has a mother's voice. It has woven itself into our deepest dreams, so that love, friendship, sympathy, devotion, memory, and hope put on the beautiful garments of its treasured speech. No man is poor or desolate who has this treasure for his own. When the landscape darkens and the trembling pilgrim comes to the valley of the shadow, he is not afraid to enter. He takes the rod and staff of Scripture in his hand. He says to friend and comrade, "Goodbye, we shall meet again." And confronted by that support, he goes toward the lonely pass as one who walks through darkness into light. That's from Companionable Books by Henry Van Dyke. This story, this book, really is the most amazing story ever told. And it's more than just a story that we read or a book that we know, but it's an experience. It's life, and life at its fullest. And so we are so excited still to be sharing this with you and be walking through it together as a church. So we dive into session 2, having left off here, and I'll do a short recap of what we talked about in our last Facebook study. We talked about creation, and we have to keep in mind throughout this study that it is depicted time and time again, and what the two things we want to continue to see is the upper story and the lower story. And so from the very beginning, we see that unfold in Genesis with the creation. Even when life begins, you see the lower story and the conflict between man and woman, and the man having been passive. And so they partake of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and mankind falls. And so where there was this intimacy, and we established that in God's bigger story, in the upper story, He wants to be with us. With the fall of it, there's this huge separation. And so that we established also that the rest of the story is being spent in God's relentless pursuit of mankind. And then Cain and Abel were born, and we saw their conflict and how Cain murdered Abel. And then we see the intent of man's heart grow evil and even more evil as time goes. And we get to the point where God says there's not a man on earth save one who is worthy, has any righteousness in his heart at all. And so Noah was that one man. And so God decides to flood the earth, essentially do a reboot, a restart, and it's kind of crazy. If you ever seen like the movie series The Matrix, the premise in that is that the Matrix goes on for a long time, and then at some point it just does a reboot because things start to go badly. So essentially, probably a poor comparison, but essentially this is what God has done here with the flood. They decided it's time to reboot, restart, but He doesn't say that there's no hope at all. With God, there's always a hope. 1 Corinthians 13 reminds us that love hopes all things. And so God's hope was placed in this man Noah and his family. And so they build an ark, and they're saved. But even then, after the reboot, after the flood waters recede, Noah's sons see him naked and laugh at him, and one of his sons in particular gets in trouble. And so we see that even with the family that is Noah's and that righteous family, that salvation, perfect purity, that restoration, redemption, and justification isn't going to come from one of us. Even the best of us, it can't be done because we're sinful by nature. And so they wrapped up the last chapter with this. The earth recovered from this great flood. Animal and plant life flourished. Noah's family repopulated the earth. The cycle of life continued, and people remembered God. Ancient businesses grew, homesteads and farms developed, and trade routes brought wealth and opportunity for travel. It was time for God's next move. Time to build a nation in a land that would become the cultural and ethnic home to, well, that part of the story is yet to come. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Abram, whose name God later changed to Abraham, had all the wrong qualification for being a founder of God's nation. His relatives worshipped other gods in a country far from what would become the promised land. Abram and his wife Sarai, whose name God later changed to Sarah, were way beyond childbearing years, and Sarai couldn't get pregnant. No children meant no people to populate God's nation. No problem. God promised the impossible to Abram, and Abram watched as the impossible occurred. And here's how it happened. And so that's how they wrap up the first chapter. And so if you actually have the storybook, we will go through a lot of chapter 2 to 9, touch on some interesting ideas presented in this chapter, God Builds a Nation, which kind of navigates through Genesis 12 all the way to 35. And so it's on page 13, and you can go ahead and turn there. Or if you have just your Bible with you, just turn to Genesis 12. We have this man, Abraham. Okay, and so God has a plan. He always has a plan. He's had a plan since the very beginning. He knows how it's going to unfold. Okay, and so up to this point, it was Noah. Okay, and so then Noah's families just kind of filled the earth and they spread out. And so God decides this time how we're going to do this. Instead of doing a whole reboot, instead of just completely wiping out all humanity and do another Adam and Eve thing in the garden, what he decides to do is just pick a root, pick a tree in essence, pick someone whom he can lean upon, whom he can trust in. So he goes into the world that time, which at that point the world was not a great place. It was full of idolatry. And this place that Abraham actually comes from, U-R, yeah, really funky name for a town, but was this sort of cultural hub. And if you have that Biblical Times map with you, or you're looking at the front of your storybook, you'll see that was actually really close to the original Eden, which would have been more in this area. And then that Persian Gulf and that water. And so it's a really rich area. And it's just a cultural hub of the world at that point. So it's a really big city that he comes from where like all the possibilities are. Why would you ever want to leave that city? If you're a farmer, you got the fertile land. Businessman, you've got all the trade routes and different things like that all right there. And you got the water. You can move down up and down the coast like that. And so why would you ever want to leave there? Most people wouldn't. And so here starts the story of redemption. Okay, and you'll see the rest of the time we're walking through this story that God's plan is redemption. And if you've ever doubted in your life at different moments in your lower story as God has been revealing himself to you, or maybe you just haven't been seeing how he's revealing himself to you, if you've doubted that redemption is possible, you have to know that from the very beginning of the need for redemption, God has been in the business of redeeming. If he had a business card, redemption would be part of his motto, because this is sort of the beginning of his ultimate plan for redemption. and the promise we see back in Genesis 3, the covenant made between him and man, and him and Satan to crush them and raise us back up and restore that relationship, begins here with this man Abraham. Okay, so it had been hinted at in the Garden of Eden, but now 2,000 years. Okay, so 2,000 years separate the garden from where we are right now. Okay, so now 2,000 years after the creation and fall of man, 400 years after the flood, in a world lapsed into idolatry and wickedness. And so, pretty much what I was saying before, God called Abraham to become the founder of a movement having for its object the reclamation and redemption of mankind. Quoting George Halley there. So he starts with this one man, and his idea, his plan is to build a nation, a chosen nation, from those whom would descend from this one man. And so he calls him out. But let's talk a little bit more about Abraham before we move on. Just to really get into his character. It is a Bible study, so let's learn some stuff. Abraham was born when his father Terah, Terah, was 130 years old. People lived forever back then. I don't know if they had the miracle of life juice or the fountain of youth. I don't know. But they seemed to live a really long time. A guy like Methuselah living for like 970 years. It's just crazy. But, you know, some suggest that's because of the proximity to the garden days. And we just, some of that life was still a remnant within our beings. And so it kind of prolonged our days in that way. But God later in the story establishes a certain lifespan that we wouldn't really go over. But 130 years old, Abraham was born when his father Terah was 130 years old. And Abraham wasn't the firstborn, okay? His father Terah had several children. But more importantly, moving from there, when he was called out of Ur to the land of Canaan, and he first went to Haran, he was 75 years old. Okay? So God calls him on this, and it's, okay, so it's about, I think, 400 miles to Haran from Ur, and then 600 from Haran to Canaan, or the other way around. Regardless, it's an 1,000 mile journey for a 75-year-old man and his family to go on. So this man would have been established in our world. He'd be retired. He would have a good homestead and all this stuff. And so, you know, the lower story here is this man being his life being turned upside down. And he's having this call from God, and to everyone else, he seems kind of crazy. And I can't imagine what they're saying about him. But 75 years old. And so the different points in his story, he meets different people. When he rescues Lot from Sodom, he's 80. When he meets Melchizedek, he's also 80. He's 86 when Ishmael, his first son, is born of Sarai's Egyptian handmaid. 99 when Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. 100 when Isaac, the son of the promise, is born. He's 100 years old. 137 when Sarah dies. He's gonna die, we'll learn. 160 when Jacob was born. And that would have been his son, Isaac's son. And he died at 175 years old. And so that was about 115 years before Jacob's migration to Egypt. And we'll read about that here in a few minutes too. But this is Abraham. And he comes from a culture that is rich in idolatry. You know, in the beginning, man had one God, obviously in the garden, and then even moving on. But what happened, and the same thing that you see in the world today, is man came to worship the powers of nature because we had separation from God. And so we had ignorance, and we didn't know who God was, exactly what he was. And so a lot of times in humanity, with ignorance comes this fear of the unknown, this caving in to ourselves because we know what's here, but we don't know what's out there. And so what happened without the knowledge of God, without that proximity to who He is, we pursued other things because we were created as beings of worship and even as beings of submission. And so we searched for something. And what we found, what mankind found, was that there is power in different things, like nature. And nature exists in us and it exists in the world. Things like sex, they worship sex because sex produced life. And so they saw sex as a god. And in Babylon culture, there was this god, she-god named Ishtar. And actually they set up temples, which they would have these priestesses. And it would be a ritual thing for a weekly visit to that temple to worship the god of sex, Ishtar, goddess of sex, Ishtar, and husbands and just men from around the community to go and sleep with these prostitutes in worship of this god. And even periodically, the wives and servants would have to come and essentially umpire these events, which is just crazy. And so, other than that, they worship God of the moon, God of the sun, and different things like that. And so this is the culture Abraham is coming from. Just an insane culture, and a culture full of idolatry. So was in Babylon, or Babylonia, I should say, and Babylonians had many gods and set up many temples. You think back to the Tower of Babel. They built what they would call, or what they called, a ziggurat. A ziggurat, when you picture it, kind of looks like a pyramid, like you would see in Egypt, but it's got stairs. Like it would have a staircase up to the very top, and the rest of it would just be like these plateaus building in. So it looked like a pyramid, but it'd have one staircase leading all the way to the top, where a temple would usually sit on top. And so the Tower of Babel, it's been proposed that it was probably a ziggurat. But one of these would have existed in modern day, Abraham's day, Babylonia. And so all these things surrounded Abraham. He's being called out by this God, right? And so you wonder how God heard, or how Abraham heard God's voice in the midst of all this idolatry and all this cultural minutia, and how in the world was Abraham a monotheistic man when the rest of everyone was polytheistic? Well, there are a couple of suggestions there. One is the idea that Abraham could have learned directly from Shem. Shem was one of Noah's sons who survived after the flood. And so some suggest that Noah obviously would have shared that with Shem. Shem would have shared it with Methuselah. Methuselah lived a very long time, definitely during the time of Abraham. Abraham could have learned from a guy like Methuselah this idea of this is Yahweh. And so that's one suggestion. Another suggestion is just probably the only other possible explanation is just direct revelation to Abraham. That God just simply spoke to Abraham and had a relationship with him, and so Abraham believed. And we see throughout the story that Abraham's faith is reckoned to him as righteousness at different points because simply he heard the voice of God, he heard the call of God, and he believed. And so that's another part of this lower story unfolding in Abraham's life. And so if I'm working at the local accounting firm here in Nevada, let's say, and I've got a wonderful wife, 3-4 kids. Of course, Abraham doesn't have any kids, so let's just say no kids. And my dad lives right down the road. He owns his own little woodworking shop. Abraham's dad actually owned a shop of idols where he sold different idols. We learned that in Joshua 24 too, if you want to check that out. But and and all my family just kind of around, and I'm established, and I'm 75 years old, and I'm just kind of a nest egg. I don't want to go anywhere. And now this monotheistic God that I've learned about, or just speaking to me in dreams, or however it's happening, is telling me to go 1,000 miles away from everything that I know. And then I try to tell everyone this, and obviously they think I'm insane. This is this lower story unfolding for Abraham, and you got to connect with him here, because it makes you kind of wonder all the crazy things God calls me to. Is even close to what he does to the patriarchs of our faith, or what he calls them to? Maybe for some of us it is. I don't know. But this is what God's called Abraham to. And so Abraham sets out on this 1,000-mile journey, 600 miles to Haran, which I had that backwards earlier. It's 600 miles to Haran, which is northwest of Ur. So he's traveling from here to here. Okay, and then he stays there for a little while. Haran is still kind of a trade route hub, a lot of different hubs to Assyria, to Babylonia, to different Canaan, different places would have ran through Haran. And so he kind of knows God's not calling him here, and moves on 400 miles southeast, or southwest to Canaan. And so, quite the journey, and it's not a luxurious vacation kind of journey. He wasn't driving a 2014 Ford Explorer. He was walking with a big family, some servants, and different things like that, and it would have been a rough journey across desert plain. And so, 75 years old, kind of crazy, insane in the membrane. And so he gets there. He settles in Shechem, in the land of Canaan, in the center, and that was about in the center of the land. And then he moves. He sets up an altar there to praise God, and then he moves on to Bethel. And God just kind of told him to sort of survey the land. And so he does. And so he goes to Bethel, and from there, he goes on to Hebron, and then back, and he sets up an altar there. And eventually, famine occurs, and so he moves on to Egypt. And some things happen there, but it's not really mentioned in our book as we're going through the flow here. But I will mention to you the covenant that began with Abraham is read right at the beginning of chapter 2 of our story. Let me just read to you what covenant really means in the Hebrew sense here, when it's talking about a covenant between man and God. It says here in Keyword Study Bible, this word is used to describe God's making a covenant with humankind. It may be an alliance of friendship, like that of Psalm 25:14. Let me pull this closer. I don't have my glasses. The covenants made between God and humans define the basis of God's character in the Old Testament. They showed the strength of his divine promise from Adam all the way through to the exile and restoration. It is employed many times, God's covenant with Noah, in the form of a promise with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to increase their descendants, giving them Canaan and making them a blessing to the nations, with all Israel and Moses at Sinai, with the stipulations of the Ten Commandments, and with the stipulations of the Ten Commandments, including the guiding cases in the Book of the Covenant. The words of this covenant were kept in the Ark of the Holy of Holies. And so, this covenant is the basis of the concreteness of the relationship between us and God. And so, extremely important. He says to him, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on the earth through you shall be blessed. And so, Abram doesn't go on this journey alone after receiving this covenant from God. He goes with his nephew Lot, and obviously his wife Sarai, and they journey together for a while. But whenever they get to the land of Canaan, the famine strikes. Lot and Abram actually separate, and Lot settles near a city we know today as Sodom, which ends up being not the best decision Lot could have made. But in other news, by faith, Abraham settled at the age of 75 in Canaan, but eventually went on to Egypt because of a famine. So they had to separate, and so they moved to Egypt. Abram gets in some trouble in Egypt. It was customary for kings to a princess to take the wife of and pretty much just steal the wife of men, kill the man whom they thought the wife or the woman was beautiful. And so he gets into that case, but he ends up lying to that king and telling him that Sarai's his sister, which is a half-truth because Sarai's his half-sister. Same dad, different mom. But really it's just a lie because there's not really such a thing as a half-truth. That's just lying. God used it, but it was unrighteous of Abraham to do so, and very selfish at the same time. But it's all kind of crazy because Abraham moves from this big city where he's probably got a condo, beachfront, a Persian Gulf, all this stuff, and he goes and he lives in tents in Canaan, which is this destitute land at this point, underdeveloped, uninhabited place. And he goes and lives in tents with his family, literally tents. And he moved from whatever kind of home, luxurious home he had in Haran. With his father's family business and different things like that. And so, lower story, Abraham hits home for a lot of us. Upper story, God's building a nation. And so, let me read you this excerpt on page 14. Lot had made some bad decisions and found himself in deep trouble. He took up residence near Sodom, and Lot was Abraham's nephew, remember. In retrospect, it was a poor choice of real estate. Soon the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, and 3 other kings squared off in a battle. So ends up both of those cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, they end up being looted and being kind of crazy. Abraham and God have this thing because God wants to destroy those cities. And Abraham's like, wait, Lot's there. You can't do that. And so Abraham's like, if there are 50 righteous men, where you spared, God says, fine. But Abraham says, well, what if there's just 40? Okay, yeah, fine. 30? Okay, fine. 20, and it gets all the way down to 10, and God's like, yeah, if you can find 10, I'll spare it. And so Abraham couldn't do it, but he goes and tells his nephew Lot, and they end up escaping. Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt because she turns around and looks back. God told him not to. We know the story. And so that's part of that lower story going on. Abraham just trying to take care of his family. A lot of us just trying to take care of our family at the same time trying to honor God, and so Abram's got this conflict really going on between him and God as he's trying to take care of his family. I hope some of you can relate to that, as I know that I can. So in other news, Abraham knows that there's this big promise between him and God, but he knows about establishing him and out of him growing this huge nation, and that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. But Abram's like, I'm 80 years old, 90 years old at this point. My wife's really old too. Her room's dead. I don't know how you're going to make my descendants as numerous as stars because I have no children at this point. And so there's a conflict going on between Abraham and God about him and his nephew Lot and then him destroying those cities. Abraham's honoring God through all of it, of course, and then Abraham's confused about God's will because God's promising one thing, but his life looks like something completely different. So God's got this upper story going on. Abraham doesn't know what's happening. He doesn't understand. The psalmist says that his ways are higher than our ways, his thoughts higher than our thoughts. So we experience the same stuff because we know God has promised us this, but when we look at our life, we see something completely different, something that doesn't look like this is going to happen at all, and so we doubt. And what unfolds is Abraham's like, listen, all my possessions and everything aren't going to go to one of my descendants because I don't have any, so they're going to go to this guy named one of my servants, Eliezer, and that's not going to be, through me. And so God promised him, hey, Abraham, you're going to have a baby through your own flesh and blood. And so Abraham's like, okay, I believe you. And so 10, 20 years go by and nothing's happened. So Abraham's like, okay, well, he promised me through my own flesh and blood, but he didn't necessarily say it had to be through my wife. And so him and Sarah work up this crazy plan to make God's plans happen, rather than letting him and his sovereignty ordain these plans. And we do that too, and that's the lower story all over it. We hear God's promise, and we're like, how can we make this happen? Instead of saying, God, it's in your hands, it's in your time, and we trust in your wisdom. In the meantime, we'll just pray and talk to you and read the Bible and figure out what we need to be doing or what we need not be doing. And so they make it happen, and Abraham and Hagar have a baby. Name of Ishmael. And so that baby becomes a major problem. And Ishmael ends up being a plague. I don't know that I would even say a plague, but ends up being just a very conflicting character throughout history. Ishmael and Hagar eventually get kicked out of the camp after the son of the promise, Isaac, is born. They get sent out to the wilderness. Hagar and him, they're starving, they're thirsty out in the wilderness. Hagar puts him under a tree, and she walks away because she doesn't want to see him die, because she figures she's going to starve to death. God sends an angel to talk to Hagar and says, hey, listen, he's the son of Abraham. I made a promise. His descendants are going to be really numerous, so you don't have to worry about that. Look, there's a well. And so Hagar goes and gets water for Ishmael. And Hagar eventually dies in the wilderness. Ishmael becomes an archer and sort of just this wild man. He settles in the region of Arabia, and becomes the founding father of the Arabic nation. And as God promised, or foretold or prophesied, the Arabic nation and the Israelite nation have been at odds since that day. And that is the story of Abraham and Sarai trying to make God's plans happen instead of letting God's plans, in His own time and through His own will happen. Millions of people have died because of that. Now, I'm not saying that because of our interruptions of God's plans and His timing, that millions of people are going to die. I'm not saying that it won't happen either. I don't know. But a lot of times our lower story won't be that impactful, but it will be on one or two lives. I guarantee it. I can promise you that. And so what do we learn from that? Trust in God's timing and His will and His perfect wisdom. He'll get it done. He makes a promise. He's faithful. And so when Abraham is 100, they give birth to a son named Isaac. When Sarah gets that news, she laughs because she's like, God, you're crazy. My woman's dead. My old man is an old man. He's 100 years old. That's not going to happen. And so they give birth to a son named Isaac. And God tells them the name Isaac. Isaac means laughter. And so God gave Abraham a child of promise, but Abraham had a child already through Hagar Ishmael, and so we learned what would become of him. And so we move on in the lower story. What we come to is when Isaac is about 15 years old, and Ishmael was about 15 when Isaac was born, but we can only assume Isaac was maybe 15, maybe in really the range somewhere between 9 and 15 probably. And God comes to Abraham and essentially tests him and says, you need to go and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice your son Isaac. Maybe I can't imagine what goes on in his head, but Abraham responds and says, "Yep, I'll do that because you gave me him, and I trust you." Scripture, if you read Hebrews, it seems to indicate that that Abraham believed that God would bring Isaac back from the dead, and that's why he was so faithful. And even believing that is extremely faithful act. And so Abraham was going to do it, and he would have done it because of what he believed. And so Abraham, 115 years old at this point, Sarai, 105, something like that. They go up, and Abraham gets a servant, gets a donkey, a couple servants, gets a donkey, collects some wood and some things to offer a sacrifice. They go up to the Mount Moriah. They leave the servants and the donkey behind. They carry the wood. Or Abraham has Isaac carry the wood for his sacrifice. And Abraham's got the tools he needs to make the sacrifice happen. In other words, the knife he's going to put in his son's heart. And they climb the mountain. It's kind of crazy to believe that this was happening. And to everyone else, they would have assumed that Abraham was a crazy man. And if something like this were to happen today, Abraham would be put in jail forever. If it was in Texas, he'd probably be given the death penalty. And so this is an absolutely ludicrous event. And everyone, other than maybe his wife, is looking at him like, dude, you're going to kill your son? Because you think you heard God tell you to do it? Listen to that just for a second, how crazy that sounds. If someone told you that they told you that today, you'd be like, who do you think you are, Abraham? Like, in other words, you'd be like, you're insane. That's not happening. You can't just kill your son. God would not ordain you to murder someone in seemingly cold blood. And the way I read the scriptures, a lot of times we misinterpret the way that God works. But that's another topic. And so what we have to remember with this story, the lower story going on, the upper story is this idea originated not with Abraham but with God. And it's part of God's plan of redemption. And so what's really, really cool about this story is Mount Moriah actually, you go forward 2,000 years and you have the story of a 32-year-old man climbing the same hill, the same mountain, with carrying his own wood for his sacrifice, while those who will sacrifice him are carrying the tools to their trade. And him believing that he will be resurrected, knowing that plan, as God revealed it to him, of course. You wonder, as you read books or watch movies, and you see little things that happen, little things that sometimes people point out and be like, that means something, or look at the string of events that this writer has put together, and like, look at this color on this wall that happened in this scene. That's purposeful. And you're like, you're crazy. Just watch the movie. It doesn't mean anything. I'd like to sit down with an author and really work on describing to everyone the process that a writer goes through when being extremely intentional about everything that happens. And the New Testament the Hebrews promises us that God is the author of our salvation, which means he wrote the book to our salvation. And so I have to believe that he's extremely intentional about every aspect of this story. The colors, the little insignificant winds that blow through, whatever it is. And so this event, every aspect of it, the fact that it's on Mount Moriah, which is Calvary or Golgotha 2,000 years later, and that Isaac's carrying his own wood, and that Isaac is completely submitting to his father's will, while at the same time understanding that what's going to happen, but wishing he could get out of it, uncanny. And so God's telling the story of redemption from the very beginning of his initial covenant with Abraham, who is the father of our faith. And so that's just crazy. George Halley says this way: a substitution, an actual sacrifice, and it was on Mount Moriah, the very same place where 2,000 years later God's own son was offered. Thus it was a shadow in the birth of the Hebrew nation of the grand event the nation was born to bring about. Kind of crazy. Actually, really crazy. And so we know the story. They go up. Abraham's got the knife over Isaac. The wood's spread around him. And an angel comes and stays Abraham's hand. And God provides a ram. And they sacrifice the ram. And they go back down from the mountain. And so Abraham's life was kind of crazy, but he was extremely faithful through it all. Eventually Sarah died. We're on page 21 if you're following with. Eventually Sarah died, and Abraham bought a field and buried her, wondering all the while what would become of him and Isaac and God's promise. Abraham had taken another wife, a woman named Keturah, and had more children, yet his entire estate went to the special son of promise, Isaac. Abraham died when he was 175 years old and was laid to rest next to Sarah. But the story is far from over. Isaac married Rebekah, and as was the custom, she was chosen for him, but he did really and truly love her. 20 years after the wedding, the couple was still childless. Typical story. But in response to many prayers, Rebekah gave birth to twins. We probably know those twins' names as Jacob and Esau. And so their life ensues. Esau grew up to be a hunter and sort of a manly, outdoorsy kind of guy. A lot of men in our church, in our community, are this type of man that enjoy the outdoors, that are really, they're really hairy. And they eat a lot of red meat, and they kill the red meat. And this is Esau. It's sort of like, me hungry, me want food kind of guy. I'm not saying that all you guys are like that. I'm just saying this is Esau as described, and just sort of this thick, strong, brutish kind of guy. Then Jacob, kind of softer. So Esau was obviously Isaac's favorite son, first son born, and son of the birthright would have belonged to Esau because he was born first. Isaac didn't have a problem with that. Isaac loved Esau. And so then you had Jacob. Jacob was kind of softer. He enjoyed cooking. Enjoyed staying home, hanging out with mom, and was sort of soft-spoken. But don't give up on Jacob. He's got a few aces up his sleeve, and we're gonna dig into that here in just a second. They grew up, and the entire time they kind of vied for the inheritance rights, and Jacob's mom, Rebekah, the whole time was kind of wondering how to get Jacob the birthright, because she knew as soon as Esau got it, Jacob was kind of going to be left hanging, and she wasn't sure what would become of Jacob. And so sometime later, Isaac was laying in bed. He was weak. He was sort of almost blind, and Esau was out hunting. It was the day that Isaac was going to give Esau his birthright and give him the blessing. And Jacob and his mom have contrived this plan to cook some meat stew and bring it into Isaac. So Rebekah dressed up Jacob in a bunch of animal skins and things that Esau would have wore. So he came in, and Isaac sort of smelled Esau and was like, or Jacob, and was like, "Are you sure this is him. And so Jacob knelt down, and Isaac felt the furs on Jacob. And was like, oh, surely this is Esau, because Esau's really hairy, and so he assumed that Jacob was Esau. And so he ate the stew and then gave Jacob Esau's birthright. He gave Jacob the blessing, and it was irrevocably so. The blessing was given. It was ordained by God, and it happened. Esau came home, and as you can imagine, there's so much lower story happening here, but this is just like a family dynamic, jealousy between brothers. Same thing we saw between Cain and Abel, but a little bit different. And a mom looking out for the baby, and sort of at odds with dad about it, and dad's favorite son being the strong, athletic one, and sort of, that's my son kind of guy. And a lot of us can connect with this story in those ways, and I pray and hope that the Spirit will reveal those things to you. But Esau is ticked when he comes home, and Jacob and Rebekah knew Esau was going to be ticked, and so Rebekah sent Jacob off, and Jacob went and lived with his uncle Laban for 20 years, lived there, and to escape Esau's wrath, all the while having received the blessing. While he's with his uncle Laban on this sort of forced vacation, he falls in love with his bosses and his uncles, and same person, daughter Rachel. So Laban sort of says, okay, Jacob, if you work for me for 10 years, you can have my daughter in marriage. So he works for him 10 years, and Laban says, wait, but you got to marry my oldest daughter first. And so he makes him marry his oldest daughter, Leah, and so then he said, okay, but I really want to marry Rachel, so how's that going to happen? So he said, give me another 10 years of work here on the farm, and you can have her. And so Jacob works another 10 years, and he ends up marrying Rachel at the end of those 10 years. So 20 years go by, he marries those two women, and actually ends up marrying two of their servants in a very polygamous, not God-ordained sort of marriage. And they head back on this long journey to his father Isaac, who is still alive at this time. So on the journey back, Jacob's terrified that Esau is going to come and get him, and is going to meet him. I mean, he's heard that Esau has kind of been established, found his way in the world, and sort of has all these men and stuff. And so Jacob's terrified that he's going to be slaughtered by Esau. And so on the journey, what he ends up doing is sending these gifts of sheep and cattle and goats ahead, and one by one, by different servants, presenting them to Esau as they begin approaching each other. Of course, they're really far away at this point, so it's not like they can see each other as they're approaching each other. But he sends them ahead, and Esau's receiving these gifts, and Jacob's still kind of terrified and praying to God that everything's going to be okay. At this point, Jacob's actually pretty established too. He has hundreds of cattle and sheep and goats and stuff like that, and so and servants and wives and right, different things like that. So on the journey, some interesting things happen. One, he has a vision where God passes the promise to Jacob. Up to this point, it's sort of been an eliminative promise. In other words, it was Abraham, and then out of Abraham's sons, it was just Isaac, and then out of Isaac's son, it was just Jacob. But at this point, God's going to kind of flip the switch and say everyone underneath Jacob is going to be recipients of the promise. And so that's kind of cool, to see that happen, and God's promise and that upper story kind of unfold there. And so Jacob and his family and his wives are traveling. They get to the river Jabbok, just a point in the wilderness. And he sends his servants and his family across the river. Jacob stays behind. So he's left all of his possessions with them. He sends all of them with them. And so he's all alone here in this desertous region, sort of just in the dark alone, and so that seems kind of scary. A couple things about Jacob you might not have known. Jacob by name actually means like grabber or deceiver. Um, and so, you kind of see that, it doesn't say that Isaac and Rebekah were told what to name their twins, but you kind of wonder if God kind of planted that seed because he knew what kind of person Jacob would grow to be as he grabbed the birthright from Esau, and he deceived his father to grab the birthright from Esau. Kind of crazy. That's his name. And so what happens at this river while he's alone in the dark is, and Jacob's been wrestling with God his whole life, and God's will for him, and Jacob trying to figure things out for himself with his mom, and then going there, getting his wife, and just sort of never really coming to peace between him and God. And so an angel of the Lord meets Jacob at the river, and they wrestle. To Jacob, it appears as a man at first, and just a man, just like you or I, if you're a man and you're listening, and they wrestle. And they wrestle through the night. And eventually the angel of the Lord grows tired of the fight, of the wrestle, and touches Jacob's hip in the socket. And some would say that he broke his hip. But Jacob went the rest of his life with a limp after that. And essentially, the man said, let me go for his daybreak. He says, I won't let go of you unless you bless me. And the man asked, what's your name? And he said, Jacob. Obviously, the man would know what that meant. And so he changed his name. And his name, from that point on, means he struggles with God, and the struggle still, even into old age, kind of continues between Jacob and God. But after that occasion, he does come to peace terms with God. We kind of all go through that period of life where God kind of just breaks us. Some call it the wounded warrior period, between a man and God, and to where we're wrestling against his will, and struggling to understand what he's trying to do, and at the same time trying to accomplish things on our own. We just have that season of life that God wrestles with us, and then just breaks us in a horrible way sometimes, in ways that we don't think that he would ever do. But again, I would contend that a lot of us just don't understand or have misconceptions about the ways of God and what he really desires. But that wrestling match happens, a pretty crazy event in Jacob's life. And they go on from there. He meets Esau. Esau is like, whatever, dude, I forgave you a long time ago. You can have your gifts back. Jacob says, no, I'll keep them. Esau goes on. Eventually, Esau's descendants kind of just disappear from the history books. But Jacob goes back and sees his father before he dies, and settles back in Canaan, in the Promised Land, the land that God had promised to him and his descendants. And so his name now changed to Israel. God renews that promise with him. So they moved on from Bethel. And when they were still some great distance from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, don't despair, for you have another son. As she breathed her last, she was dying. She named her son Benoni, but Israel named him Benjamin. And so at this point, they've had several kids. Jacob, by all four of his wives, he's had two or three kids, but only a couple by Rachel, the wife that sort of is the one that he really, really loved and wasn't manipulated into marrying. And so his sons, if you don't know, were 12. He had 12 sons. And the sons of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Leah, Issachar and Zebulun. The sons of Leah's servant Zilpah was Gad and Asher. The sons of Rachel's servant Bilhah were Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Leah were Simeon, Levi, Judah, and Reuben, the firstborn. And actually, Reuben, after they've grown up and they're in the land of Canaan, Reuben ends up sleeping with one of Jacob's concubines, and being the firstborn sort of taints that name. So it's just lower story stuff going on. So we separate ourselves from these biblical families because they're like in the Bible, but they're really just real families with real dysfunctional problems. The dysfunctional family has existed since the beginning of time. We just separate ourselves from it because we're human, and so we don't really want to think that we can connect in that way, but the reality is that we do. Couple interesting things as we close here. Abraham married Keturah back. If you remember that part, we talked about it. He had several sons through Keturah. Actually, the Midianite people came through that relationship. And if you know anything of the scriptures, Moses ends up marrying a Midianite woman. So kind of cool to see that they're also descendants of Abraham there. And to know that kind of can console you. That's 500 years later, down the road from then. Let's see. The polygamy going on in Jacob's family. Yeah, that might be a cause for question for many people because he is a father of our faith. He is a patriarch, and sort of why did God allow that to happen? Well, God allows a lot of dark things and sin to happen in the world. He's always given us the freedom of our choice. And he knows the intentions of our heart. And even in Romans 1, it talks about whenever we want something so bad, he's just going to give it over to us if we continue to struggle against his goodness in that way. But that polygamous family and their dysfunctional issues, which were many, is a credit to God's grace and his mercy. That family was accepted and used in crazy, awesome ways by God. So, lower story, God can use your family no matter what it looks like. Even if you've gone as far to mess up as far as marrying another wife at some point in your life, that's not to say that God isn't powerful enough or merciful enough to use you here in this life. If you come to a point where you're submitting to his will and choosing to honor him through obedience, and giving up those things which are going against his will. So he used Jacob. God. So 3 things we see from that: God uses human beings as they are. 2, there's no indication that everyone that God thus uses will be eternally saved. God uses tons of vessels in this world. Some, if you read Romans, I think it's Romans 9. If you read Romans 9, Paul talks about the idea that God uses some vessels for righteousness and some vessels for wrath in this world. Full well knowing the intention of man's heart, and so understanding what choices we're going to make, he uses whatever those choices are to his glory, because he's just awesome, and he's wise like that, and he can do that. And who are we to question? Paul says that earlier. Who are we to question that? And so, Abraham had been dead about 100 years. Isaac was still living when Jacob returned to Canaan. And that pretty much concludes our study through the 2nd chapter and really Jacob, Abraham, and Isaac's life. We see a little bit more about Jacob in the next chapter. And I know this has been a long one. I appreciate you sitting through it with me. And hopefully you've learned a lot about the different things that these families faced growing in the faith and becoming the nation that God is building, and how we connect with these families, and how their lower story is really, I mean, a lot of our lower stories. But the entire time, this whole upper story is going on, that God's redeeming mankind, and that He can use, and in the upper story, He can use these dysfunctional families, these dysfunctional people that lie and say, "No, this is my sister. You take her, so I won't die, and you do whatever you want with her." And He's using these people and redeeming them, and still establishing His covenant with them, which we talked about is this redeeming restoration of a relationship. So it's really cool stuff, and hopefully you're connecting with this as we walk through it. So the book here that we read, this Bible, the book, is amazing. And so I'm going to conclude letting you know what the chapters are for our next study, and I'll conclude with what the chapter reads here. But next time I'm with you, our next Facebook session will be our third one. We'll be talking about Joseph, and God has a purpose. Genesis 37, 39, really just through 37 through the end of Genesis. So if you could read that, if you're just following us through Facebook, if you could read that in preparation for our next one, that would be awesome. And lower story, God can use you. He has a way of providing at different points, and a way of being sovereign through His will. And He has a way of redeeming. And really, next time we talk, that redemption is going to be seen abundantly. Not that we didn't see it tonight through this study, but the redemption of mankind is what He's about, that restoration of the relationship we established. He wants to be with us, and He's making that happen. Even from the very beginning with Abraham and Isaac, we see the story of the cross, and He's working to get us back. And right now He's doing it through this nation, Israel. And so it's going to be exciting to see how that unfolds. I pray that you'll walk through that with us and see what that looks like, and how that experience connects with your lower story as God's conducting His upper story in all of our lives. Let me read this to you, and I'll say goodnight. God's story of promise and prosperity moves from Jacob to his son Joseph. Of Jacob's 12 sons, Joseph was clearly Jacob's favorite, leading the rest of Jacob's boys to resent their younger brother. Jacob only heightened the family stress when he gave a beautiful coat to Joseph. And Joseph didn't help matters when he twice told his brothers that he had a dream that they would someday bow down to him. Finally, the brothers had heard enough from their arrogant little brother. They hatched a conspiracy for 17-year-old Joseph. It would be a very bad day indeed. So exciting stuff, suspenseful stuff. Hopefully you are on the edge of your seat with anticipation. So go ahead and read that all the way through the end of Genesis, and we will see you next time.